Hey everyone, how you doing? So we are here at Chapter 9, Native Americans, the Assault on Tribalism. So this is going to be a little bit more of an in-depth view slash also a modern perspective on the recent viewings of the Native American tribes, some more assimilation policies, and kind of having a discussion on what it really means to be part of like the current Native American tribes and processes, and some of the challenges that they're having recently in terms of COVID-19 and in terms of, let's say, governmental funding. The book starts off with this wonderful kind of view of Helen Hunt Jackson. She was an American poet and writer who became an activist for the better treatment and improvement of treatment of Native Americans by the United States government. She was attending in 1879 a lecture by Mr. Standing Bear, right? This very prominent chief of the Poncas. And so, she went to the lecture, heard him speak on their various relocation that they had to endure a few years earlier. And this truly kind of led her into, sort of an activist mindset, of looking at these people and everything they've had to go through. And so she was spurred by all this activism and everything else she was reading and hearing. And so she went into writing, right? So I know the old saying, the pen is mightier than the sword, ends up, being true here. So her first work was Century of Dishonor, written in 81, which was brutally indicted Native American policy. She essentially was saying that the United States government was having a terrible go at, U.S. Native American relations. And so this work of hers actually led to the Bureau of Indian Affairs appointing her to be a special agent on the matter. 3 years later, probably her more famous work was Ramona. This was a romantic tragedy chronicling the decline and eventual demise of a particular Californian tribe. And so her hope was to, quote unquote, write a story that would do for the Indian a 1,000th part of what Uncle Tom's Cabin did for the Negro. For those of you who have never read Uncle Tom's Cabin, it is a brutalistic depiction of life in the South and everything that they had to go through, in the area, as far as, let's say, racism, segregation, name calling, all of that. And so, when talking about Ramona, when talking about that piece of work that she poured her lifeblood and sweat and tears into, she said, "My lifeblood went into it. All I had thought, felt, and suffered for 5 years on the Indian question." And the Indian question, quote unquote, is that archetypical phrase that people were using in North America, especially in the United States, of the Indian question. What do we do with the Indians? What do we do with the Native Americans? How do we progress, right, into the future, into the next century? These were things that they had to consider and think about. And she was advocating for a more positive perspective, right, on what hopefully to do. And we touched upon this a little bit previously, but the decline in autonomy for a lot of the Native American tribes in the late 19th century, right, continued. And so they had a series of setbacks and defeats. So, the Nez Perces in Montana had to flee away. There was certain guerrilla warfare with the Apaches in the Southwest that ended up dissipating after a certain amount of conflict. Battles of the Plain Indians, right, was all but shut down. And of course, like previous chapters that we looked at, encroaching settlement, right? So all of the Westerners, all the expansionists, all of the migrants coming over from the east of the United States, pushing on westward through manifest destiny and other means. They had these large fenced farms, towns and cities, railroads, diseases, etc., ultimately pushing and moving the Native Americans right off of their land. Oh, I went dark. And so, ultimately the book states it very well. Native Americans surrendered the hunter-warrior ideal and accepted passive roles as wards of the state. Also endured Christianity. Indian people now dwelled in a society where the privileges of whiteness permeated the political, social, and economic structure. So this is a very poignant sentence and has a lot within it. So let's strip it a bit. So the author is trying to explain here that the hunter-warrior mentality and ideal that once permeated throughout the Native American community has been beaten down. That prideful, honorable method of their lifestyle of roaming the land and being free has essentially been made obsolete. And so now they have been forcefully brought into the fold of the United States and become, as it says, passive wards of the state, incorporated into the American hegemonic power, and now living within the kind of imperialistic might of the U.S. And so Christianity follows. Being part of the United States follows. And certain privileges, and especially during the 1800s, right? Certain privileges of whiteness permeating all facets of life, right? Because there was still that implicit social hierarchy at play, right? Where whiteness, however you want to configure that, was seen at the top of the hierarchical scale, and then kind of going lower and lower and lower, and then Native Americans, African Americans, blacks were somewhere right towards the bottom set. And so that type of mentality was still there, right? The Indo-European esque mentality. And so Native Americans, going from their once very prideful, lifestyles of roaming the land, going wherever the seasons and the buffalo and the livestock took them, riding their horses for miles on end, having tribal, intertribal warfare, being honorable warriors, right? All of that started to become more and more obsolete as time went by, and modernization and immigration waves started to push forward. We even saw with the Apaches in the Southwest, even though they implemented various guerrilla warfare tactics, they still were unable to mount a long-lasting, let's say, stand, only a temporary one, because when you're dealing with millions upon millions of new migrants, there's only so much you can do. You can throw a pebble in the ocean, but it is a mighty ocean nonetheless. And so the tale of assimilation, that over time, as we've been talking about previously, the United States policy of sovereignty and reservations started to form and continue, whereas all of these Native American tribes, the ones that were left over and still retained some of their unity, ended up getting incorporated into the semi-autonomous reservations in the United States. And so the populations were, obviously over time diminished greatly from all these reasons that we've talked about previously, from disease to smallpox, right? All these other things. And so, their excuse me, their economic situation did not improve greatly either. But they still wanted to retain their sovereignty over their land, right? Their ancestral homelands to the best of their abilities. And so they entered into eventually negotiations with the U.S. government to have control over their land. And to this day, they are the only ethnic group in the United States to actually have pieces of land that they control in the U.S. And so the assimilation goals here were, from the United States government's perspective, was that the reformers wanted to divest Indians of their culture, introduce them to Christianity, teach them English, and prepare them to be functioning members of white society and the economy. And so over time, it was the hope from a lot of these U.S. governmental forces that Native Americans will slowly start to shun away from their Native American heritage and become incorporated members of the American system. And here's a wonderful video I found of a conversation with Native Americans on race. What does it mean in the modern day and context to be Native American? What does it mean to have X amount of blood, right, from the blood quantum? How do various tribes perceive you to be Native American or not? And how does the U.S. government perceive you to be Native American or not, right? Interesting, very interesting clip. So if you have a few minutes of time, definitely give this a watch, please. And so as the United States was moving forward throughout the West, we had all these instances of, right, all of their rituals and sort of tribal elements slowly but surely, converted and stripped away, right? And having policies that kind of don't necessarily say that it's illegal as much, but definitely there are much more incentives to be part of the kind of overall grand scheme of white economic strength in the U.S. over traditional. And so over time, moon dances, sun, ghost dances, those are seen as very kind of Native American and shunned against. Obviously, this does not happen every single day, but there's some forms of it that are or were being persecuted against. Modernly, within the reservation systems themselves, right, they have various festivals every single year, and so they practice a lot of their ancestral dancing and worships and prayer, right, in their native tongue. And so here we have more of a discussion on, let's say, the Christian reformers and churches. So on top of working alongside of the federal government, these Christian churches and Christian reformers are on a fast-paced track towards trying to reform these individuals. They're trying to advocate for more Indian education, establish missionary schools to convert them to Christianity, remove children from their tribal environment, hence plucking the kids out while they're young, placing them in English Christian schools and indoctrinating them from an early age, force them to speak English and punish them for speaking native tongue, urge them to become, if they can, commercial farmers or just anything else, especially as the second industrial revolution came to be. At least it's getting into more kind of industrial work. And so over time, we do see by the late 1800s, some of the government, have started to outlaw ghost dance and sun dance, depending on the regions. And so there is this heavy sort of snowball effect that has happened, right, of trying to assimilate the Native Americans forcefully. Here we have a couple modern day, right, Native American, tribe members. And so they are detailing what it's like to be living as a modern Native American individual and 6 misconceptions about them. So some misconceptions you possibly might have about the modern day Native Americans. So they kind of try to dispel that. 1871, we ended up getting the Allotment Act. The allotment program, excuse me. This allowed the president to break up reservation land, which was held and reserved for them, into small allotments to be parceled out to individuals. Now, this was initially seen as a good thing, right? Or on paper, it looks like a good thing. We're going to break up all of this land and give all of these families, upwards of 160 acres of their own land, just like the Homestead Act, right? Except this was passing the Indian Homestead Act, quote unquote. So on paper, that sounds great. However, once you chalk it up to actual acreage, originally, the federal government gave them all of this acres of land, totaling around 138 million. However, if you take all that land and only give each individual member 160 acres of land, that accounts to only 40 million acres of land. So they're suddenly seeing their land kind of shorten and getting smaller. And 1871 was a major turning point in all of these negotiations because it switched from negotiating to tribes to legislating for them. And that's a very important thing to understand. Previous to 1871, these various tribes still held some type of power or authority at the negotiating table. They could still say that, we want to come to the table and negotiate because we are still autonomous. We have our armies, we have our men, we can cause trouble. After 1871, the United States government starts treating all of these tribes as subjects. They start treating the tribes as citizens. And so they start to say, no, we have officially incorporated you into the system. You will now adhere to all of Congress's laws. And so by the 1920s, the life on reservations were now changing. Early life on the reservations was not great. Filled with malnutrition, tuberculosis, dysentery, etc. Death rate was double the national average. During the time, we had an explosion of muckraking journalism in various aspects of life. The most famous one from a national news headline was the meatpacking scandal, where journalists went into meatpacking industries and saw that the meat was being packed into, let's say, these small containers for consumers to purchase, but the meat was like thrown on the ground. There's blood and dirt there, but they don't care. They're just packing up the meat and shipping it off. And so the journalists will come in and blow the story up. And so nationally, people are reading this. I'm saying, dear God. Theodore Roosevelt got involved as well, and then they were changing the industry. As far as Native Americans, right, we have similar journalists coming in and trying to expose institutions and leaders for their corruption. And so some of these journalists were focusing on the plight of Native Americans, writing numerous programs, getting them on radio, lecturing in academic circuits, and trying to tell the public, like, look what's going on to the reservations. Look at what has happened to these people. And so it started to work. Public opinion started to turn towards them. And so, the public opinion started to then reject any bill that was seen to strip natives of more land and more rights. And so a modern parallel can be the recent oil pipeline projects. So the recent pipeline project was the XL Keystone Pipeline, or the Dakota Pipeline. And we're going to talk about this towards the end of the lecture. But the recent news on that is these big oil companies and corporations, they were going through South Dakota with a big line of, an oil line going towards Canada. And so, right, that's a good thing on paper, right? We have more oil, trade, etc. But a portion of the pipe was going over their water supply, their fresh water supply. That is not a good idea, because pipe breaks. God forbid if all that oil seeps into the fresh water supply, right? That's not a good thing. So they sued the federal government and saying that, this is obviously clearly not right. And so we'll talk about that during the end of the lecture. There has been a recent decision on that. In 1934, we saw the Indian Reorganization Act, where the centerpiece of it was calling it the Indian New Deal. So it restored tribal authority, allowed them to draft their own constitutions, assuming ownership of the reservation and however they wanted to do their land allotments, receiving funding for their people. Annual money allotments created a reservation welfare state for a short period of time. And so it started to convert some economic dependence tied to the federal government. And conditions were not improving fast enough. Modernly today, not every one of them gets, any type of like welfare state or money governmental checks, but it really depends on the reservation, what kind of system they have in place. And so this is what modern reservations could possibly look like. Yes, in the middle of these beautiful, expansive areas and territories, but, far away from other big city centers, right? And so eventually the Bureau of Indian Relations ends up meeting with the president in the White House. And so they start to try to come up with all of these negotiations, right? And trying to give some more power and feedback and leeway for the Native American tribes. '20th century legislation changes. So now we're moving into the Citizenship Act, proposed to grant full U.S. citizenship to the indigenous peoples of the U.S. Excuse me. With Congress' passage of the Indian Citizenship Act, the government of the U.S. now gives citizenship to all Native Americans born within the territorial limits of the country, signed by President Coolidge. Now, this is even on the next step, right, of incorporating these peoples into the U.S. And so before the Civil War, citizenship was only offered limitedly to these Native Americans of 1/2 or less Indian blood. In Reconstruction period, Republicans in Congress wanted to accelerate the granting of citizenship to friendly tribes. By the late 1880s, most Native American women started to just marry U.S. citizens to also gain citizenship. By 1919, Native American veterans of World War I were offered citizenship as well. And by 1924 now, this all-inclusive act was passed by Congress. So instead of piecemeal Native Americans, for one reason or another, being offered full U.S. citizenship. Now, all of them entirely are offered full citizenship by law. And then we have one of the first famous Native Americans getting into the highest political form of the land, Charles Curtis, an American attorney and Republican, who was elected in 1928 with the ticket of Herbert Hoover. And so he was the first Native American vice president of the United States. And so he was roughly 3/8 Native American ancestry and 5/8 European ancestry. On his mother's side, Curtis was a descendant of Chief White Plume and Chief Pahuka of the Osage tribe. And so he had wonderful ancestry from both sides that he got, and especially from two chiefs, which is a great prestigious honor. And so the main point here is that political and social change was allowing for Native Americans and their descendants to pursue now higher levels of education, political office, complex careers, and attaining some of the highest levels of political office in the land. So offering all of that inclusive citizenship definitely opened the door, right, and the possibilities. Fast forwarding to the 60s. In the 60s, we started getting Martin Luther King Jr., right, and all of his civil rights movement. And alongside with that, the Civil Rights Act for Native Americans, or here called the Indian Civil Rights Act, was also created in 68, granting all Native Americans for the first time full access to the Bill of Rights. So as you can tell, it is a step-by-step process. And so now they are guaranteed the rights of freedom of religion, habeas corpus, not being jailed unlawfully, etc. Johnson signed it very beautifully, and the 60s were seen as a time of equality and prosperity, right, to move forward amicably throughout history. And so all of these also sub-movements started as well. Grassroots movements found in various cities around the U.S., initially, right, kind of focusing on urban development and urban issues to address systemic issues of poverty and police brutality against Native Americans as well. Funny enough, right, this particular one, the American Indian Movement, AIM, was started in Minneapolis, where modernly Minneapolis has been a hotbed of BLM and Black Lives Matter issues. History repeats itself, folks. Well, it doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes. It rhymes very well in this particular case. I believe I showed this in a previous lecture sometime, but it still holds true. So because of LBJ's signing of the Civil Rights Act, here we have the War on Poverty speech that he made at the State of the Union address, right? Really addressing all of the minorities, the Mexican Americans, the Native Americans, anyone at that time in the country that was believed to have less privileges, right, or less opportunities to succeed than others because of socioeconomic difficulties, right, and other things. And so he was pleading to Congress, let's get this done. Let us give all of these children at least the same fair opportunity to move forward legally. And legally they did. This is a beautiful congressional speech in 1989 by American Indian activist Russell Means. He was advocating in front of a Senate hearing. And this is a little bit on the longer side. It's around, I think, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. But it beautifully details a lot of the issues the Native American communities were facing, even up to the late, 1980s. Detailing how the casino industry was affecting them, how government subsidies was affecting them, how encroachment on the land, etc., X, Y, and Z. All of these sort of issues and plights of the community were being, laid out over here. And so it's a really interesting speech to listen to if you have an extra 20 minutes of your time. Some modern topics to go through today that are, influencing the communities. The first link over here, we have tribal casinos being centers for the community. Some communities are lucky and fortunate enough to have a big, central, powerful casino at the center of it, gaining a lot of money, which they then use to funnel back into the community, right? For schools, for education, other programs. And so casinos in some territories can be seen as a great moneymaker and supporter of these various communities. The resistance fights for the oil pipelines has been a consistent issue as well over the years. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe won a victory in the Dakota Access Pipeline case, in 2020. And then now the Dakota Pipeline case has had another big win because the federal judge and government, as far as this video on the bottom right-hand corner showcases, that the federal government finally told all of the oil pipeline companies to take down the pipeline. It is officially not met with the environmental standards that one needs to perform if your pipeline is going anywhere near bodies of water. And so the team of engineers apparently did not do a diligent enough job because, God forbid, if there is going to be a crack in the pipeline or a burst, their fresh drinking water supply is going to be tainted, which is not easy to clean up. And even if you do try to clean up, it's just, it's not the same. Some modern issues that they are still facing today, very in particular the coronavirus fight. And so Indian country is being disproportionately also affected from the disease for two main reasons, I believe. First reason is, well, actually, three reasons, I would say. The first reason is they live in close proximity with one another, right, in close living quarters. Many of these reservations and villages are remote. They are far away from major cities. Perfect example would be, I myself visited it, Havasupai Village, near Havasupai Falls in the Grand Canyon. This small village is literally in the middle of the Grand Canyon, and it is miles and miles away from, like, quote unquote, other big cities or civilization. And so they also have higher risk of pre-existing conditions. Many of these folks are suffering from diabetes, heart disease, cancer, asthma, etc. Apparently, their diets their modern diets with the amounts of sugars and everything else that they've been ingesting does not agree with their bodies genetically. Apparently, centuries and centuries of eating very clean organic food, and suddenly moving towards soda and other, let's say, modern luxuries, right, with our cuisine and our palate, does not agree with them. And so because of those existing conditions that they have, a lot of them are being ravaged by COVID. And also financially. So financially, anyone who is in the lower socioeconomic totem pole of society typically gets hit more disproportionately, whether that's homeless, whether that is anyone at the poverty level or getting food stamps, right? Anyone who's at the bottom always hits the hardest. And so, they are now asking for money and supplies for the reservations from the federal government. And so they are trying to supply get the money supply, right, as fast as possible to hopefully stem some of these issues. And so here's a wonderful new video with updates on why so many Native Americans are dying from the coronavirus. It is definitely not the most ideal of solutions, and definitely it's a conversation to talk about, and hopefully in the future, something to be done for all of these communities, right? But with that, our short little chapter is done. This chapter was not as long as the rest and the others because it was more of a kind of modern day kind of pickup and update on the Native American situation. But that will be the end of chapter 9. Also to be included in the study guide for the midterm. So definitely as you are going through the study materials, definitely try to look at all of the more important bold words that we had, the citizenship acts, and all of those various things that can be kind of filtered in and asked as far as, let's say, the Native American experiences and communities, right, in the United States. But like always, I want to thank you so much for being here, for listening. Hopefully it was fun for you. It's always fun for me. And study for the midterm. It's coming up. And I wish you all the very, very best. Email me if there's any issues. But thank you so much for listening to Chapter 9, and I will see you around for the next chapter. Take care, folks.